I still remember the exact moment it happened. Not because it was loud or dramatic, but because of the silence, the kind of silence that cuts deeper than words. We were at my husband's family reunion in Ohio. The backyard was filled with long tables covered in white cloths, children running with plastic cups, and uncles arguing about football. Everyone was laughing, talking, living a picture-perfect family moment. Except for me. I smiled and stepped forward, as I always did, and said, "Hi Carol. It's so nice to see you. The garden looks beautiful." My mother-in-law, Carol, looked directly at me. Then she turned her head and spoke to my sister-in-law instead. She didn't respond, nod, or even acknowledge my presence. She had made it clear, I did not exist. I felt my face heat up instantly. People noticed. I noticed them noticing. My husband, Daniel, was across the yard, laughing with his cousin, completely unaware. I swallowed the sting and stepped back. This wasn't the first time she had acted coldly. Over the years, Carol had been polite but distant. Her hugs were stiff, her smiles rehearsed, her compliments conditional. She asked questions like, "What does your family do?" Or, "Are you planning to work forever?" With a tone that made me feel judged. I wanted peace. I wanted acceptance. So I tried harder. I cooked holiday meals, remembered birthdays, and brought gifts. Nothing changed. Her behavior escalated from coldness to subtle humiliation, speaking about me instead of to me, interrupting me, correcting me in front of others, praising Daniel's ex-girlfriend whenever I was near. But the ignoring, that was new. That was cruel. Later, I excused myself and went to the bathroom. I stared at my reflection. I didn't look weak, but I felt invisible. I splashed water on my face, took a deep breath, and told myself to survive. When I came back, Daniel noticed my red eyes. "Hey, are you okay?" he asked softly. "I'm fine," I lied. Because explaining what had just happened would sound dramatic. I still hoped I was imagining things. As the evening went on, I noticed Carol watching me. Not openly, but carefully. Every time I laughed, she looked away. Every time Daniel touched me, her jaw tightened. When I spoke about work, she observed from across the yard. This wasn't indifference. This was fear. Later, during dessert, she spoke directly to me for the first time all day. "Enjoy it while it lasts," she said, her eyes fixed on the pie. I blinked. "Excuse me. Family gatherings," she continued. "They don't always stay comfortable." Then she walked away. My hands shook. That wasn't casual, it was a warning. That night, Daniel fell asleep quickly. I couldn't. Carol's behavior replayed in my mind. I opened my laptop and searched her name. Old articles appeared. 15 years ago, she had been the treasurer of a small nonprofit. Thousands of dollars had gone missing. She had resigned quietly before charges were filed. The case was handled internally. No trial, no conviction, no apology. I realized why she feared me. I worked in finance. I understood audits, paper trails, accountability. She had always been afraid of exposure, and now, somehow, the pieces fit. A week later, during another visit, Carol asked Daniel to help his father in the basement. I followed. Dust and old cardboard filled the air. A box pushed in the corner caught my eye. Inside were folders, receipts, bank statements, and a letter addressed to Carol about irregular transactions at the nonprofit. "Put that down," she snapped. I turned. Her face was pale, eyes fixed on me. "That's private." Daniel, confused, asked, "Mom, what's going on?" "You shouldn't touch things that don't belong to you," she said sharply. I carefully put the folder back. It was open. "I wasn't snooping," I said calmly. That night, she treated me with exaggerated politeness. She offered tea, complimented my dress, and smiled whenever I spoke. I realized the power dynamic had shifted. She was trying to fix something. But it was too late. The truth had been revealed. 2 days later, she invited the family for dinner. I knew it wasn't warmth, it was damage control. The night of the dinner, candles glowed, laughter filled the room. Carol played the perfect host, but her eyes betrayed her fear whenever they met mine. During dessert, she raised her glass. "I want to say how grateful I am for family. Especially for having a daughter-in-law who is learning how things work in this family." The room went quiet. Daniel stiffened. Her words were a public warning, not praise. I stood up calmly. "Family values honesty, accountability, and respect. And maybe we should talk about the things that were hidden instead of addressed." Her face drained of color. I turned to Daniel. "There's something you don't know about your mother." I told them everything, the nonprofit, the missing money, the letter in the basement. Gasps filled the room. Daniel stared at his mother. She opened her mouth but no words came out. That was her answer. From that day forward, Carol never ignored me publicly again. Respect replaced fear. The family dynamic had shifted. Daniel and I grew stronger, and our marriage was fortified by the shared experience. Family gatherings became lighter, warmer, and honest. Carol adapted quietly, no longer controlling or manipulative. The younger generation observed honesty and integrity being valued over fear and pretense. Through it all, I learned that silence can hurt, but truth heals. Humiliation may sting, but courage, patience, and observation can change everything. Once the truth is spoken, no secret, no manipulation, no attempt at control can ever have the same power. And the mother-in-law who once ignored me publicly became a silent reminder that honesty and integrity ultimately prevail over fear and secrecy. The days after the confrontation were strange but relieving. Daniel and I had spent the evening processing everything, and the weight of the truth hung in the air like a heavy curtain finally lifted. Carol was different now. She no longer tried to dominate conversations, and she avoided the sharp comments that once cut through the room. I noticed her efforts to be polite, subtle and cautious, but genuine in a way she had never been before. The tension she had created for years was gone, replaced by a quiet awareness of boundaries. Daniel and I found ourselves talking more about family dynamics. We laughed about moments that used to frustrate us, realizing how much we had endured together. We discussed how to handle future events and how to protect ourselves while maintaining peace. The experience had strengthened not only our bond but also our confidence in facing difficult situations as a team. Family gatherings slowly returned to normal, but with a new sense of openness. Conversations flowed naturally, laughter came easily, and even Carol's presence no longer felt threatening. She contributed quietly, helping with dishes or offering advice without trying to control. Her attempts to assert power had vanished, and the family had adapted. I also noticed how Daniel's siblings reacted. They treated me with genuine respect, and even his father seemed relieved. The subtle competitions and judgments that had long existed in the family had softened. People no longer felt the need to perform or tiptoe around hidden tensions. Honesty and patience had reshaped the family dynamic. Sometimes, I caught Carol watching me, her expression cautious. I knew she was aware that the balance had shifted. I didn't fear her anymore. I understood that power built on secrecy and intimidation only lasts as long as the silence remains unbroken. Daniel and I continued to grow, planning our own traditions rooted in transparency, fairness, and respect. Holidays became joyful instead of tense, and we taught our children and nieces and nephews the value of integrity, courage, and speaking the truth. Even when Carol offered unsolicited advice or commented on decisions, it no longer carried the weight it once had. We listened politely, considered what was reasonable, and gently but firmly maintained our boundaries. Her influence was no longer absolute, it had been rebalanced by honesty and awareness. I often reflected on the first moment, the backyard reunion where she ignored me publicly. That moment, painful as it was, became the catalyst for growth. It forced me to observe, to understand, and to act with courage. The humiliation had sparked awareness, and awareness had led to truth, and truth had shifted the family entirely. Through this experience, I learned that strength is not always loud. It is quiet, deliberate, and patient. It is the courage to observe, the wisdom to act at the right time, and the commitment to honesty even when it is uncomfortable. Most importantly, I learned that silence and secrets can only hold power as long as they remain hidden. Once truth is revealed, it reshapes relationships, restores balance, and teaches lessons that last a lifetime. Carol's secret, once buried, had ultimately brought clarity, growth, and transformation, not only for me, but for the entire family. And through it all, I realized that public humiliation, as painful as it feels in the moment, can sometimes lead to the most profound and lasting change. The weeks that followed brought a sense of calm I hadn't felt before. Family gatherings became less stressful. The subtle tension that had once defined every holiday, every birthday, and every simple Sunday dinner had dissipated. People spoke more freely, laughed more easily, and interacted without fear of judgment. Carol continued to attend events, but her presence was measured. She contributed when necessary, offered advice cautiously, and no longer tried to assert control. I noticed that she had learned the limits of her influence. The power she once wielded through fear and secrecy had disappeared, leaving only a quiet, respectful participation. Daniel and I found ourselves enjoying the family in a new way. We shared stories, jokes, and meals without the weight of hidden conflicts hanging over us. We became a team in every sense, not just in marriage but in navigating the complicated web of family dynamics. Our children grew up observing honesty and courage in action. They saw that conflicts could be handled with calm and integrity, that boundaries could be maintained without anger, and that truth always holds more weight than silence or deception. Even Carol's subtle glances, once filled with judgment or disapproval, were now tinged with recognition and perhaps even admiration. She had realized that her tactics no longer worked. Respect was earned, not demanded, and she was adapting to a reality she could not control. I often reflected on the moment she ignored me publicly. At the time, it had been humiliating. I had felt small, unseen, and powerless. But that moment had set off a chain of events that revealed hidden truths, restored balance, and transformed our family. It was a painful lesson in courage, observation, and the importance of acting with integrity. Through it all, Daniel and I grew stronger. We learned to communicate openly, to support one another, and to confront difficult situations with clarity and calm. Our marriage had been fortified by the shared experience, and we approached life with renewed confidence and resilience. Even as Carol remained part of the family, the dynamics had shifted completely. Her secret, once a source of fear and control, no longer held any power over anyone. The family learned to operate with transparency, respect, and accountability. I realized then that silence can be used as a weapon, but truth always finds a way to pierce it. Once revealed, it restores balance, reshapes relationships, and teaches enduring lessons. The mother-in-law who once ignored me publicly had inadvertently taught me the most important lesson of all: courage, honesty, and integrity cannot be diminished by humiliation, manipulation, or fear. Once the truth is spoken, it changes everything. As months turned into a year, the effects of that first confrontation became more profound. Family gatherings, once stressful and tense, now carried a sense of warmth and honesty. People laughed without hesitation, shared stories openly, and treated each other with genuine respect. The patterns of manipulation and subtle control that had existed for years had faded. Carol attended events, but she no longer attempted to dominate or assert her will. Her comments were careful, polite, and devoid of judgment. It was clear she had learned the lesson: power built on fear and secrecy is temporary, but respect earned through integrity lasts. Daniel and I continued to grow stronger together. We had learned to support each other not only emotionally, but strategically, in navigating the complexities of family relationships. Our bond deepened as we confronted challenges side by side, strengthening our marriage and our confidence in our ability to handle anything life presented. I began to notice subtle shifts in the younger generation as well. Daniel's nieces, nephews, and cousins were observing a different model of interaction, one where honesty was valued over appearances, and courage over compliance. They learned that speaking the truth and acting with integrity could influence the environment positively, while manipulation and silence could no longer dominate. Even Carol, at times, seemed to acknowledge the change. Her glances, once sharp and critical, were now cautious and measured. I could sense the awareness in her that the balance of respect had shifted. She could no longer control the room through fear or intimidation, and she knew it. I reflected often on that initial moment, the backyard reunion where she publicly ignored me. The humiliation I felt then had sparked a sequence of events that uncovered hidden truths, restored fairness, and transformed the family dynamic entirely. I realized that courage doesn't have to roar. It can be quiet, deliberate, and patient, waiting for the right moment to act. Daniel and I also cultivated new traditions, ones based on transparency, mutual respect, and honesty. Holidays, birthdays, and family events became occasions of joy rather than tension. We taught the younger members of the family the value of standing up with integrity, observing carefully, and responding wisely when confronted with manipulation or judgment. Even when Carol attempted advice or commentary, it no longer carried the weight it once did. We considered her words, responded politely, and maintained our boundaries. Her influence had been recalibrated, not through confrontation, but through the revelation of truth and the steady application of patience and courage. Through it all, I came to understand a fundamental truth: silence can be used as a weapon, but it is fragile. Secrets can only hold power until they are revealed. And when truth emerges, it restores balance, teaches lessons that endure, and reshapes relationships in ways manipulation never can. The mother-in-law who once ignored me publicly had, in her own way, become a teacher of the most important lesson I had ever learned: honesty, integrity, and courage are forces that cannot be diminished, and once truth is spoken, it changes everything. Over the next several months, the family began to function in a completely new way. Daniel and I noticed the difference immediately. Conversations were smoother. Laughter was easier. The underlying tension that had once defined every gathering was gone. People spoke freely, shared opinions, and even disagreements were handled calmly and respectfully. The atmosphere, once heavy with unspoken judgments and subtle manipulations, had lightened considerably. Carol attended most events, but she no longer tried to control them. She helped quietly, offered advice cautiously, and never attempted to dominate a conversation. The once formidable presence that had created fear was now just another member of the family, contributing politely and respectfully. I observed Daniel's siblings reacting differently as well. They treated me with genuine respect, no longer mocking or undermining me in subtle ways. Even Daniel's father seemed relieved, as if a long-standing tension had finally lifted. The family dynamic had shifted completely, and the change was permanent. Daniel and I continued to strengthen our marriage. Facing the challenge together had built a foundation of trust and resilience. We learned to communicate openly, support each other, and set boundaries that were respected. Our unity became a model for others in the family. Our children began to see the lessons in action. They observed honesty and courage being valued over fear and manipulation. They learned that speaking the truth, maintaining integrity, and standing firm in the face of difficulty could shape their environment positively. Even Carol began to act with awareness. Her subtle glances and cautious words reflected a recognition that the balance of power had shifted. She no longer had the ability to intimidate or control. The respect she had once demanded through fear was now earned through measured politeness. Reflecting on that first moment when she publicly ignored me, I realized its significance. The humiliation I had endured had been the catalyst for transformation. It forced me to observe carefully, understand the dynamics, and act with integrity. That one moment of public disregard led to the uncovering of long-hidden truths, ultimately reshaping our family forever. I also realized something crucial about relationships. True strength is not loud or aggressive. It is quiet, patient, and observant. It is the courage to stand firm, the wisdom to choose the right moment, and the commitment to integrity, even when it is uncomfortable. Through these experiences, I learned that silence can be used as a weapon, but truth has a way of emerging. Once revealed, it restores balance, teaches lessons, and reshapes relationships in lasting ways. Carol's secret, once buried and powerful, had ultimately lost its ability to harm. Instead, it became a lesson for the entire family about courage, honesty, and integrity. The mother-in-law who once ignored me publicly had inadvertently become a catalyst for lasting change and a reminder that truth, once spoken, cannot be ignored. Life continued, and with it, the subtle transformations within the family became more apparent. Daniel and I found that even routine gatherings carried a sense of ease that had been absent before. Conversations flowed naturally. Laughter was genuine. The old patterns of judgment, competition, and silent manipulation no longer dictated interactions. Family members began to trust that honesty and respect would prevail. Carol's presence was noticeably different. She attended dinners and celebrations, but her behavior was measured and polite. She no longer issued veiled criticisms or subtle corrections. She helped quietly and contributed to the family in small, meaningful ways. Her attempts at control, which once created fear and tension, had been replaced by cautious participation. Daniel and I took full advantage of this new dynamic. We planned family events that were inclusive, transparent, and fair. We encouraged open discussion and emphasized the importance of integrity and accountability. Through this, we reinforced the lessons of courage and honesty for the younger generation. Our children, nieces, and nephews began to observe a new model of family interaction. They saw that speaking the truth and standing firm in the face of subtle manipulation earned genuine respect. They understood that fear and secrecy may provide temporary power, but they could never replace the influence of integrity and transparency. Even Carol seemed to sense the shift in balance. Her cautious glances and polite words reflected an understanding that her old tactics were no longer effective. Respect could no longer be demanded through intimidation, it had to be earned. And in this, she adapted quietly. I often reflected on that first moment, the backyard reunion where she publicly ignored me. At the time, it had felt humiliating and isolating. But it had been the catalyst for everything that followed. That single moment led to discovery, confrontation, and ultimately, transformation. Daniel and I grew stronger as a couple. Facing this challenge together deepened our bond and taught us invaluable lessons about communication, patience, and the importance of confronting difficult truths. We learned that integrity and courage often have subtle, long-term effects that extend far beyond the immediate situation. Through all of this, I realized that silence can be used as a weapon, but truth always finds a way to emerge. Once revealed, it restores balance, strengthens relationships, and reshapes family dynamics in ways that manipulation never can. Carol's secret, once a source of fear and tension, had become a turning point for the entire family. The mother-in-law who had ignored me publicly had inadvertently taught the most important lesson of all: honesty, integrity, and courage cannot be diminished, and once the truth is spoken, it changes everything. As the seasons changed, the family continued to adapt. Daniel and I noticed subtle improvements every time we gathered. The tension that once defined family events had dissipated. Laughter came naturally, conversations were honest, and disagreements were handled calmly. People no longer feared judgment or manipulation. Carol's presence remained polite and measured. She contributed when needed, offered advice cautiously, and never attempted to dominate conversations. The fear and control that had once defined her interactions had vanished. The balance of power had shifted, and she understood it. Daniel and I thrived in this environment. Our marriage strengthened as we navigated family dynamics with patience, honesty, and courage. We hosted gatherings that encouraged openness, mutual respect, and transparency. These experiences taught the younger members of the family valuable lessons about integrity, accountability, and the power of truth. Even the younger generation began to understand the lessons firsthand. They observed that honesty and courage earned respect, while manipulation and silence could no longer maintain influence. The family was becoming healthier, more open, and more balanced. Carol's subtle glances, once filled with judgment, were now tempered with caution. She had realized that respect could not be forced, only earned. Her influence had changed from control to quiet participation, a reflection of the shift in family dynamics. I often reflected on that first backyard reunion where she publicly ignored me. At the time, it had been humiliating, but it had triggered a sequence of events that reshaped the entire family. That moment of public disregard revealed hidden truths, restored balance, and transformed relationships. Daniel and I learned that strength doesn't need to be loud. It can be quiet, patient, and deliberate. It is the courage to observe, the wisdom to act at the right moment, and the commitment to integrity even in difficult circumstances. I also learned that silence and secrecy have limited power. Once truth is revealed, it reshapes relationships, restores fairness, and teaches lessons that endure. Carol's secret, once a source of fear and tension, had ultimately lost its power. The mother-in-law who had once ignored me publicly had become a symbol of the strength that honesty, courage, and integrity bring. Once truth is spoken, nothing and no one can hold the same power over you again. Time passed, and the transformation in our family became permanent. Daniel and I noticed that every gathering, no matter how big or small, carried a sense of ease that had been absent before. Conversations flowed naturally, laughter was genuine, and even disagreements were handled with patience and respect. The underlying tension that had once dominated family events had vanished. Carol continued to attend, but she no longer tried to control anything. She contributed quietly, offered her advice only when appropriate, and never attempted to dominate the room. The power she once held through fear and silence was gone. She had learned that respect cannot be demanded, it must be earned. Daniel and I thrived in this environment. Our bond deepened as we faced challenges together, strengthened by trust, communication, and a shared understanding of honesty and integrity. We planned family events that encouraged transparency, openness, and fairness. The younger generation observed these changes too. They saw that courage, honesty, and integrity were respected far more than manipulation or intimidation. They learned that speaking the truth, even when difficult, shaped relationships positively and earned lasting respect. Carol's behavior had shifted subtly but unmistakably. The sharp glances, the veiled criticisms, the controlling comments, all were gone. In their place was a cautious, polite, and measured participation. She had adapted to a new reality where fear no longer granted her power. I often reflected on that first backyard reunion where she publicly ignored me. At the time, it had been humiliating and painful. Yet, that very moment became the catalyst for change. It led to the discovery of hidden truths, the exposure of secrets, and the eventual transformation of family dynamics. Daniel and I realized that true strength does not need to be loud or aggressive. It is quiet, patient, and deliberate. It is the courage to observe, the wisdom to act at the right moment, and the unwavering commitment to integrity. Silence and secrecy can only hold power for so long. Once truth is revealed, it restores balance, teaches enduring lessons, and reshapes relationships in ways manipulation never can. Carol's secret, once a source of fear and control, had ultimately lost its influence. The mother-in-law who once ignored me publicly had become a symbol of how honesty and courage can triumph. Once the truth is spoken, it changes everything, and no attempt at control can ever hold the same weight again. As years passed, I began to notice the full impact of that one pivotal moment on my life and on the family as a whole. Family gatherings were no longer defined by fear, judgment, or subtle manipulation. Conversations flowed easily, laughter came naturally, and disagreements were met with patience and understanding. The tension that had once hung over the family like a cloud had lifted completely. Carol remained a part of our lives, but her presence had changed entirely. She participated quietly, offered advice cautiously, and no longer attempted to control or dominate anyone. The power she once wielded through silence and intimidation had vanished. She had learned that respect must be earned, not demanded. Daniel and I thrived in this new dynamic. Our marriage grew stronger with every challenge we faced together. We communicated openly, supported each other, and set boundaries that were respected by everyone, including Carol. The shared experience of confronting hidden truths had fortified our relationship in ways we could never have imagined. Even the younger generation observed the transformation. They saw the value of honesty, integrity, and courage. They learned that speaking the truth and standing firm in the face of difficulty earned lasting respect, while fear and secrecy could no longer maintain influence. Carol's subtle glances and measured words reflected her awareness that the balance of power had shifted. Her attempts at manipulation were ineffective, and she had no choice but to adapt quietly. Respect was no longer demanded through intimidation, it had to be earned through careful participation. I often reflected on that first backyard reunion where she publicly ignored me. At the time, it had felt humiliating and isolating. Yet, that moment had been the catalyst for change. It had revealed hidden truths, reshaped family relationships, and restored balance. Daniel and I learned that true strength does not need to be loud. It can be quiet, deliberate, and patient. Courage is the ability to observe, act at the right moment, and maintain integrity even when it is uncomfortable. Silence and secrecy can only hold power temporarily. Once the truth is revealed, it restores fairness, teaches enduring lessons, and transforms relationships permanently. Carol's secret, once a source of fear and tension, had ultimately lost its power. The mother-in-law who once ignored me publicly had become a living reminder that honesty, integrity, and courage prevail. Once the truth is spoken, it changes everything, and no act of manipulation or control can ever hold the same power again. With each passing year, the lessons from that first confrontation became more deeply rooted in my life. Family gatherings no longer carried tension or fear. Conversations were open, laughter was easy, and disagreements were handled with patience and respect. The subtle manipulation and judgment that had defined the family for years had disappeared. Carol's presence remained, but she had changed entirely. She contributed politely, offered advice cautiously, and no longer tried to control anyone. The power she had once wielded through silence and intimidation was gone. She had learned that respect must be earned, not demanded. Daniel and I thrived in this environment. Our marriage grew stronger as we navigated challenges together. We communicated openly, supported one another, and maintained boundaries that were respected by everyone in the family. The shared experience of uncovering hidden truths had fortified our relationship in ways we could not have imagined. Even the younger generation began to notice the transformation. They saw that honesty, integrity, and courage were respected far more than manipulation or fear. They learned that speaking the truth, even when difficult, earned lasting respect and shaped family relationships positively. Carol's subtle glances and careful words reflected her understanding that the balance of power had shifted. Her attempts at control were no longer effective, and she had adapted quietly. Respect was no longer enforced through intimidation, it was earned through patience, observation, and thoughtful participation. I often thought back to that first backyard reunion where she ignored me publicly. At the time, it had been humiliating and isolating. Yet it had set in motion a chain of events that revealed hidden truths, restored balance, and transformed the family. Daniel and I learned that real strength does not need to be loud or aggressive. It can be quiet, deliberate, and patient. It is the courage to observe, act at the right moment, and uphold integrity even in uncomfortable situations. Silence and secrecy can only hold power temporarily. Once truth is revealed, it restores fairness, strengthens relationships, and teaches lessons that endure. Carol's secret, once a source of fear and tension, had ultimately lost its influence. The mother-in-law who had once ignored me publicly had become a reminder that honesty, courage, and integrity are forces that cannot be diminished. Once truth is spoken, it changes everything, and no attempt at manipulation can ever hold the same power again. From that moment onward, our family flourished in a way it never had before. Peace, respect, and understanding replaced fear and control. And through it all, I knew the most important lesson of my life. Courage, honesty, and integrity are unstoppable when paired with truth. The months turned into years, and the lessons I had learned continued to shape my life. Family gatherings, once tense and full of silent judgment, became warm, open, and joyful. Conversations flowed naturally, laughter was genuine, and even disagreements were handled with patience and understanding. The subtle manipulations and power struggles that had defined the family for so long had vanished. Carol continued to attend, but her presence was calm and measured. She helped quietly, offered advice when appropriate, and no longer attempted to dominate. The fear she had once relied upon to control the family no longer existed. Respect had to be earned, and she had adapted to that reality. Daniel and I thrived in this environment. Our marriage grew stronger with every challenge we faced together. We learned to communicate openly, support one another, and maintain boundaries that were respected by everyone, including Carol. The shared experience of confronting hidden truths had deepened our bond and strengthened our confidence. Even the younger generation observed and absorbed these lessons. They saw that honesty and courage were more powerful than intimidation or silence. They learned that standing up for oneself with integrity shaped relationships positively and earned lasting respect. Carol's behavior had changed subtly but unmistakably. The sharp glances and veiled criticisms were gone. Her measured words and polite interactions reflected a recognition that control could no longer be enforced through fear. She had learned that the balance of respect had shifted. I often reflected on that first backyard reunion where she publicly ignored me. At the time, it had been humiliating and isolating. But it had become the turning point. That moment revealed hidden truths, restored balance, and transformed relationships in ways I could never have imagined. Daniel and I realized that strength doesn't need to be loud or aggressive. It is quiet, deliberate, and patient. It is the courage to observe, the wisdom to act at the right moment, and the commitment to integrity, even when uncomfortable. Silence and secrecy may hold temporary power, but truth endures. Once revealed, it restores fairness, strengthens relationships, and teaches enduring lessons. Carol's secret, once a source of fear and tension, had lost its power completely. The mother-in-law who once ignored me publicly became a living reminder that honesty, integrity, and courage triumph over manipulation. Once truth is spoken, it changes everything, and no act of intimidation can hold the same control again. From that day forward, our family thrived in a way it never had before. Respect, openness, and understanding replaced fear and subtle control. And through it all, I knew that courage, honesty, and integrity, when paired with truth, are unstoppable forces that can change lives forever. As the years continued, the lessons from that first encounter with Carol became an inseparable part of my life. Family gatherings were no longer marked by tension, fear, or silent judgment. Conversations were open, laughter was easy, and even disagreements were approached with patience and understanding. The subtle manipulations, power struggles, and hidden judgments that had defined the family for so long had disappeared. Carol remained part of our lives, but her presence was entirely transformed. She participated politely, offered advice cautiously, and no longer tried to control anyone. The fear and secrecy she once relied upon for influence had vanished. Respect could no longer be demanded, it had to be earned. Daniel and I continued to grow stronger as a couple. Facing challenges together had deepened our bond, taught us the importance of communication, and reinforced our ability to set boundaries confidently. We learned that confronting difficult truths with patience and integrity was more powerful than avoiding conflict for the sake of temporary comfort. The younger generation also observed and learned. They saw firsthand that honesty, integrity, and courage carried more weight than manipulation, silence, or fear. They learned that standing firm in truth reshaped relationships positively and created lasting respect. Carol's behavior had changed subtly but unmistakably. Her sharp glances, veiled criticisms, and controlling remarks were gone. Her measured words and quiet participation reflected her understanding that power could no longer be enforced through intimidation. She had adapted, and the family had flourished as a result. I often reflected on that first backyard reunion where she publicly ignored me. What had once felt humiliating had become the catalyst for transformation. That single moment revealed hidden truths, restored balance, and reshaped relationships in ways I never imagined possible. Through it all, I understood that true strength does not need to be loud. It is quiet, patient, and deliberate. It is the courage to observe, the wisdom to act at the right moment, and the commitment to integrity, even in the face of discomfort. Silence and secrecy can hold power only temporarily. Once the truth is revealed, it restores fairness, strengthens relationships, and teaches lessons that endure. Carol's secret, once a source of fear and tension, had completely lost its power. The mother-in-law who had once ignored me publicly had become a reminder that honesty, courage, and integrity prevail. Once the truth is spoken, it changes everything, and no attempt at manipulation can ever hold the same control again. From that day onward, our family flourished in ways it never had before. Peace, respect, understanding, and genuine care replaced fear, tension, and subtle control. And through it all, I knew with certainty that courage, honesty, and integrity, when paired with truth, are unstoppable forces capable of transforming lives and relationships forever.